I am Kolby Labree, and I am the owner-operator of the Belling History with the Good Time Girls. It's a walking tour company here in Bellingham, and we give fun tours about things like brothels and saloons and all the kind of quirky history of Bellingham. I'm just also born and raised in Bellingham, so I'm a history nerd. I love all the history. Yeah. So I first started out as a guide in 2012. In 2018, the former owners moved on to other things, and I took over the business. So I grew up, kind of like my teenage years in Bellingham was the 1980s and 90s, and at that time it was kind of a different town. It was still very much like kind of a dying mill town. It wasn't quite as touristy and liberal as it is now, but the Horseshoe was like one of the only places in town that was open 24 hours, and as a teenager, you know, you'd sneak out at night or whatever, and this was one of the places that we would come to. It was like this or Denny's. So the Horseshoe just sort of became one of the spots we would go to, and you know, it was kind of this like divey diner. The waitresses were kind of like grouchy old ladies, and you know, nobody really cared if you sat in here, and of course you could smoke inside back then, so we would just drink coffee and smoke cigarettes for hours, you know. So always had a soft spot for the Horseshoe. Of course, you know, once I was 21 and going to bar shows in town, this was the place you came after the shows to have your last round of drinks and eat some cheesy fries or whatever. So a lot of times, memories here in the Horseshoe.
Can I turn that camera off?
Turning it off?
Turn it off. Turn it off, okay?
He's a mean man. He's the killer fat man. To the bathroom.
So there's on the sign outside, like it's famous for the sign that says, you know, since 1886, and that's been a bit of a mystery that we've tried to like verify how they got that number 1886. But the first real clear documentation of the Horseshoe comes from around the turn of the 20th century, so around the late 1890s, early 1900s. And at that time, it was somewhere on Holly Street and moved into a building that was right across the street where today is the Bank of America, and formerly was this huge ornate building called the Lighthouse Building. And so the Horseshoe moved in there when that building was built. They had a like big horseshoe hanging outside over the door, and so it was very clearly the Horseshoe. And it was listed as that in city directories, and there's photographs of like sketchy guys standing around outside. You know, some things never change. Exactly. So that's like the earliest, like really solid, like definitely the Horseshoe. There's some people say it started out in the town of Seaholm, but one like lineage that I traced back would put it in Whatcom, so I don't know, could have been both places. But so it's complicated. A bunch of stuff happened just before World War I, so a big year for Bellingham as a town. So it consolidates as Bellingham in 1903, so now we're one big town around the bay. And then by 1910, you saw a lot of changes, including the town of Bellingham voted to go dry. So it was 10 years ahead of nationwide prohibition. The town banned the sale of alcohol in city limits. And so that kind of happened patchwork all over the country, but in Washington state too. It would be like a city, then a county would go dry, and then pretty soon the state was dry by I think 1916. So before the US involvement in World War I even. 1910 was a big year because all the saloon owners suddenly had to pivot and figure out what else they were going to sell or what business they were going to do. And a lot of them just turned into like pool rooms with billiard tables and cigar shops and things like that. And some of them kept selling alcohol on the sly. You know, and they also outlawed the red light district, which there had been a sanctioned red light district through 1910, like a designated, written in the city charter, sex work, brothels. And the saloons and brothels really paid so much money to the city. Like they were very regulated, and it was over half the city's budget when you combine those two sources of revenue. So it was really a weird shift in 1910 to where it sort of became like policing. You had to get that money through basically policing people.
That's a major shift.
Yeah, after the red light district shut down, basically all the brothels moved into uptown rooming houses. So there was a lot on Railroad Avenue and on Cornwall and up on State Street, and basically just older hotels and rooming houses became the brothels. And instead of them paying the money directly, the police would just once a month come and do a raid and like take a few of them downtown.
Yeah.
They'd pay their fines, they would go right back.
Wow.
So it was still essentially functioning. And then brothels had always served alcohol to their clients, so they became the speakeasies in a lot of cases. They still just kept on serving alcohol and selling sex even though it was illegal. So the Horseshoe is said to have been one of the spots, like in the 40s and 50s especially, when there was still the whole uptown brothel scene happening right in this area, that had, because I think it was open 24 hours, they had their safe, and the women would come and put their valuables and their earnings in the safe at the Horseshoe. So they had sort of this unwritten, it was like their bank.
Yeah.
Because they worked these weird hours and couldn't, if they were seen out on the streets, they could be arrested for street walking. So there were certain places and certain, that they could kind of go to without fear of.
It was like a safe zone.
Yeah, so the Horseshoe was considered one place, and then there was a Chinese restaurant on Cornwall. And so it really is kind of that precursor to like nationwide prohibition, when you have all that like gangs and cops and like that's what it turned into. And the jail and the police force all they had to really revamp the whole system. And they'd never really arrested many women before. There was no like women's jail until then. And then I was like, oh, what are we gonna do with all these women we now have to arrest? 1948, I believe it is, the first cocktail lounges are allowed to open, and the Horseshoe became, I think it was the third. So mid-century, they moved across the street here, and they put the big facade that's actually two buildings. They bought both of those buildings. There was a cafe and the saloon part that we're in right now, and combined them with that unifying sort of mid-century big facade, which a lot of buildings in Bellingham got weird makeovers during the 1950s. So there are actually, old buildings under here, but they really went with that. It was the mid-century, people loved their Western TV shows and movies and all that kind of stuff, and so that's the theme that they really, leaned into, because it was the Horseshoe after all. They went with this very mid-century Western motif, which is amazing. Jack Kahn and Julian Berenstein. They are the ones who took it over and did the whole move and remodel, and they're the ones who I first found advertising it as having been open since 1886. It's like, where did they come up with that? And it must have just been like an oral history story that was handed down to them, that they were like, we're gonna capitalize on this as like being super old business. But it's interesting that it never came up before then. But yeah, so they hired, Fred Oldfield, who's a cowboy artist, a Western artist who's very collectible, to do the murals in the ranch room side of things. And there's that story about the one lady in the ranch room that was painted. Now it's a cowboy, but there was originally like a saloon girl on the wall. And apparently I was one of the two owners' wives was like, no, too sexy. So they painted a cowboy over it, but now her face is like bleeding through the cowboy's face. So it's like you're sitting there having a drink in the bar going like, maybe I've had too many. I don't know what's going on with that mural over there. The more recent history, I don't quite know the whole lineage of. I know that at some point, I think they owned it through 2002, and it was Julian that died in 1992, so I think that was when they closed for the first time. So that was kind of interesting, because I think they had to like figure out how to lock the doors, Well, I know that there was a time when Travis Holland, who owned Casa Que Pasa, He took over the ranch room in the Horseshoe for a time. I know he owned it for a while, and I believe it was during that time that Rowdy Buckaroo became like this featured thing. And all I remember about it is that they paid him to like dress like a cowboy and to go around and put money in people's parking meters that were about to expire. So it was like this do a good deed kind of a thing. Yeah, and it became this whole, it was kind of like just sort of a fun media stunt, but he's a legend. He's got the mural. Yeah. Yes. And I love that. I mean, it is so like cliched, the whole like Wild West thing, but honestly, Bellingham, when the Horseshoe started, literally was that Wild West. and I love that they just were like, we're sticking with that theme this whole time. And it's fun. You know, it just still has the same vibe to me as like sort of a place where I feel like it's very welcoming of just sort of, you know, anyone can kind of come to the Horseshoe and feel at home, and you get your kind of comfort cup of coffee, and it has all the comfort foods. It's got an awesome lounge, the ranch room, with its amazing murals, and you know, just is kind of it's a little piece of history that I appreciate that it's still here and still kind of has that same vibe it's had after all these years.